Hey guys, welcome back to the Joe Silverback Show. I'm your host, Joe Bunton, and today we're going to be talking about slavery, indentured servitude, and the white trash culture that came from Europe and was a big part of the founding of the United States colonies, and then the spread west and cowboys and Indian kind of fable. So one of the things I just can't escape this history that I come from. It's in my face all the time, and it's being brought up over and over and over and over again. So I have to take it back into the Silverback Principle, which, as you guys know, the Silverback Principle is not about groups, it's about individual transpersonal psychology. That means that the sooner that I as an individual stop identifying with a particular group, the more that I identify with my primate ancestry, the more that I identify with my evolutionary biology as a leader of my tribe, my family, my troop, the more I can get on with life and live as genuine and healthy and productive of life as I choose and elect. So group identity and identity politics and connecting as a group can be pleasurable. It can be great to know that I was born of this ancestry and trace my ancestry back to the Slavs of Eastern Europe, the Poles and Slavic peoples, and the French Canadians coming from France into Canada, and Canada into Michigan, and Leclerc is my family name on that side, and Bunta is my family name on the other side. But that's a very, very limited biographical piece of information. Still, it's very pleasurable to have an identity that Eastern Europe and France and French Canada is part of the seed and egg that came to become Joe Bunton through Betty Leclerc and William Jaworski Bunta. Okay, having said that, the history, if you go back further, so most of us go back to our grandparents at the very most. We just don't even know much about our grandparents most of the time unless we were fortunate enough to live close with them, as I was for some segment of my childhood. And so let me start there. My grandfather didn't go past a 6th grade or 12-year-old education, and he was a poor, uneducated Slavic immigrant who didn't even have a birth certificate. He worked in the last decades of his life. He was a janitor at schools. Prior to that, his brothers got him a job at the Ford Motor Company in Michigan, in Detroit. And before that, in his childhood, he worked on the farm, and he also worked in the coal mines. Very poor, very uneducated immigrant. Got my grandmother pregnant out of wedlock. Poor Polish woman who, they had my father. They didn't have any money. They didn't have any education. My grandmother worked greasy spoon restaurants, and my grandfather, like I said, he barely eked out living. They lived in rat-infested tenement housing in Detroit, and My father couldn't wait to escape the poverty he came from. He couldn't wait to escape the shame and embarrassment he had by being born into uneducated immigrant parents who his more advanced brain, and my father, unlike his parents, was born with a very, very high IQ. But prior to that IQ taking shape in his life, we had his cultural surroundings, his environment, which was a very, very harsh, gets sent off to the family farm with the cousins while, his mother worked to, eke out some pennies. And his father, memories of his father going through his piggy bank in order to get, a trolley ride into town, and then the Depression, and his father, working on the roads all day for lard and beans. So that's my grandparents to my father. And then my father, I told you, he wanted to escape. So without even graduating high school, he went into the Korean War. At 17, he was flown off to Japan, where they were stationed, and they were doing, he was a paratrooper, and they were doing airdrops into Korea. So from 17 to 21, my father's crucial formative adult years were in bars with his uneducated, poor white brethren who also wanted to escape poverty and also wanted to escape, their situations and wanted an opportunity to do something else with their lives. So here were all these uneducated guys in the bars in Japan having their first, well, maybe not their first, but having their principal sex education with Japanese prostitutes, and cigarettes, booze, and hookers was my dad's education at the time. Comes home, 21 years old, meets Betty, courts her. His introduction to taking my mom out was he came to pick her up, and her father and two brothers were out on the porch with their arms crossed, and my dad drove around the block 10 times before he had enough balls to get out, go up, and be scrutinized by the males before taking out their sister and daughter. And fast forward, my mom and dad, just the average poor, not past high school education, get pregnant, have a baby. My dad's a dreamer, goes with his buddy Red to Las Vegas to gamble and loses all of his money, and remembers being stationed out in San Diego, so he gets on a bus, has enough money to get to San Diego, where he gets a job on a trash truck for the poor, uneducated white boy. And it was a trash truck that worked at NEL, Naval Underwater Electronics Laboratory in Point Loma. And there was a sign, divers wanted. So after, I don't know how long my dad had been working there, he was a good swimmer, very strong athlete. So he applied for a job as a diver. This job as a diver led to becoming a diving supervisor. And this diving supervisor basically did grunt work for the research institutes and the PhDs doing research. And my dad's job was to get all the technology to complicated places. And one of the jobs was to go to the Ocean Beach Pier and underwater hammer and chisel all the barnacles off because the pier was falling. And then other very, very tedious physical tasks And then my father was elected to become one of the aquanauts of the Sea Lab, the Man in the Sea program, pre-Jacques Cousteau, where they were off the coast of La Jolla, putting man in the sea to see how he could live underwater. So my dad's athletic ability, his grunt work, slave wage labor background allowed him to be one of the guinea pigs, and he became very good with underwater photography. So Man in the Sea program put him in touch. It was a joint military civilian operation, and there were scientists from all over the United States, PhDs, whom my dad emulated and looked up to and understood that he was from a different class. He was from the uneducated poor class. But he was now around these educated scientists, and his IQ mind expanded. Fast forward to 4 more children, and my father understood that his poor, uneducated immigrant parents didn't provide for him the background or the framework for a good education, and so he was going to do that for his children. So I grew up with 60 days to a more powerful vocabulary, study these words, study these German words, and if you get, all of us kids got 100 German words that we memorized, he would put a second telephone in the house. And with 5 kids and 2 adults, a second telephone, landline, was powerful motivator. Fast forward, and my father and mother divorced. My father was an only child, and he was not a stay-at-home parent. And he was an adventure explorer who thought about, just like when he went to Las Vegas, he was always dreaming about, his next big discovery, the next gold mine. Well, my dad was going after sunken treasures, and he opened up a card room, and he formulated a salvage and diving company so he could go and salvage a ship that he thought had tons and tons and tons of gold and silver and other precious metals on it, which it did, but he never got access to it. But that was my father's dream, and he left us for his dream. This isn't a boohoo story. This is just how education works, and how lack of education works, and how values evolve in family. So the thing that did get passed down from my father, I got into a lot of, that's the point I missed. So when my father was gone, I was 9 years old when they divorced, and he was never around. He was in Africa, he was in Japan, he was in Saudi Arabia, where they were using his diving expertise for different things. And so us kids got into a lot of trouble, and I got into a lot of trouble. I got kicked out of 2 junior high schools in the same year. I went to my last junior high school, and the next step from there was a adolescent youth program connected to juvenile hall. My dad came back. He saw this problems. He got us, and he begged the sister or the mother who was up at the private Catholic high school to take us without pay because we didn't have money. And we got to a private Catholic high school. I had long hair down to here. They had me shave my hair. I learned discipline. I learned religion. I learned that I also could advance myself. Counselor there at the school took a liking to me, as did the principal of the school, as did some of my teachers, because I enjoyed learning, and they pushed me, and I eventually went to university. That's the point in the narrative of the story. The immigrant journey in America, the immigrant journey in the United States is always connected to what's family life like, whether or not there's going to be a push for education in the home, whether or not there's going to be a push to keep pregnancy from happening prior to wedlock, where statistics show that the chances of success are much greater. And that was my father's saving grace for my brother and I. And it's what kept me off the streets. It's what got me away from the drug scene that I would have been heavily involved in. And it got me off of criminal behavior. White trash is hard to break. My father could never break the concept that he was white trash, that he came from uneducated, poor immigrants. And even though he had a huge IQ, he couldn't shake his cultural roots. But he passed on a new culture to his children and his grandchildren. And that gave all of us greater opportunity and possibility to break through the barriers. This is part one of the evolution of white trash culture in the United States, and what does that mean in terms of breaking through cultural and privileged barriers. Namaste, part one. Stay tuned for part two.